All right, so today we'll be talking about a peer-supported project looking at a case study in Chiba, the Nahama Ward, which is a really interesting case study of liquefaction or lack of liquefaction from the Tohoku earthquake. And part of this project also is developing a community laboratory test database. And I'm going to give a real brief overview of the next generation liquefaction project because the case study that we're working with is in there, and then also the laboratory test database has been deployed through NGL. So next slide, Ken. So the three goals of the NGL project: first is to develop a community database of liquefaction case histories. The database is there. It's never going to be done because it's intended to really be an evolving and growing database as people continue to add data to it, but the framework is all done and there's quite a bit of data in it. And then second is to perform supporting studies to fill knowledge gaps. That's things like overburden pressure effects or any other issues that we don't quite have a handle on right now. And then third is model development, liquefaction triggering and consequence models. Next slide. So the project management committee is Jonathan Stewart. He's hiking today and couldn't be here. Otherwise, he would probably be telling you all about NGL. Steve Kramer and John Stamatikos. John Stamatikos is from Southwest Research Institute. We also have a project advisory board. Jonathan Bray, Ross Boulanger, and Misko Kubranovsky are executive advisors at IDRIS. And then we have a database working group. I'll let you read the names there. And we meet bi-weekly to just talk about the status of the database, if there are new data sets that should go in, and importantly, we conduct reviews of all of the data that are entered into the database. Next slide. So far, we have 3 modeling teams. There's one team that is led by Steve Kramer that is supported by the NGL project, but there are 2 other studies where researchers have gathered their own projects, their own funding sources, and they're partnering with us. And so we welcome that. If you'd like to become a modeler, you just have to agree to kind of meet with us frequently, share information and ideas and so forth. So the first modeling team led by Steve is also me, Paolo Zimero, and Kristen Ulmer, and Ken has also been heavily involved in that. Then there's one by Laurie Bays and Brett Maurer. And then a third one with Kevin Franke, Scott Olson, Brett Lingwall, and Armin Studline. And then we have a couple of supporting studies as well. Brian Carlton is looking into K sigma and K alpha effects, so overburden and static shear stress effects on liquefaction. And Armin Studline has done a lot of work on susceptibility of fine-grained soils, low plasticity fine-grained, silts and clays. Next slide. So if you go to our website, this is what it looks like. The URL is cut off a little bit there at the bottom of my screen, but it's nextgenerationliquefaction.org. I'm the proud owner of that domain. The screenshot shows all of the earthquake events that have created liquefaction case histories. And then you can zoom in and look at some data. If you want to actually look at plots of cone penetration test data or boring logs and things like that, observations of liquefaction or lack thereof, you have to create an account and sign in, which you see up there in the top right. Accounts are free, no big deal to create one. And then you can add data too. So there's a way that you can put your own case history data in here or your own laboratory data in here if you would like to do that and participate. Next slide. So this is a table. These tables summarize the counts of different data types that are in the database currently. The row on the top is the total number. So you can see we have 849 cone penetration tests, 679 boreholes, 125 invasive geophysical tests. Those are mostly downhole CPT tests. So far, 30 non-invasive geophysical tests. So that would mostly be spectral analysis of surface waves, and then over 1,000 water table measurements. The database working group reviews all of these data. So a user can start putting data in, and if they're not quite ready to submit it for review yet, it's only accessible to the project team. Then they push a button and say, go ahead and review it, and the database working group reviews it. So the distribution, reviewed, under review, and in preparation are also shown, just to show you where we stand. Reviewing these case histories is a lot of work. It's pretty tedious. What we're basically looking at is trying to make sure that the information in the database matches the source documents that it came from. And then down below, you have site sites that have observations. And sometimes there's like an observation for a whole site, and part of the site will have had liquefaction and part of it won't. So we also have specific location observations. So there's over 1,000 of those, and fairly evenly divided between liquefaction and non-liquefaction. There's 218 lateral spread cases, and then 173 cases where liquefaction has caused structural damage. The rest are more like free field liquefaction cases. Next slide. Then this one is laboratory test information. So over 1,300 Atterberg limits tests, over I think the 4,000 maybe each grain size measurement, not each grain size test, but there's relative density, consolidation, simple shear, and triaxial. And the consolidation, simple shear, and triaxial kind of just starting to be populated because this is new stuff that we've just formed the schema for as part of this project. Next. We have a YouTube channel. We've been conducting frequent webinars, so you can go and watch some of our interesting webinars here about really relevant, kind of up and coming issues with respect to liquefaction evaluation. Next. And then finally, the interaction provided by our GUI is pretty limited, right? We have a website where you can go and put data in, you can view data plots, but if you really want to do something like calculate liquefaction displacement index or something like that, you can't do it. You'd have to download the data locally and then work with it. So to facilitate that kind of interaction in the cloud, we have the database replicated every day to design safe. And there's a partner data app there. So if you go click on this next generation liquefaction app, it'll take you to a set of Jupyter notebooks where you can write your own Python code to query the data. And that's how Ken has been doing his work. So it's kind of a nice workflow because it's always current and you don't have to download gigabytes of data to your own computer. So I think that's my last slide, and I'll hand it off to Ken to talk more specifically about the Mahama Ward case.
Yeah, thanks, Scott. So I'll just briefly mention a little bit more about the recent addition of the laboratory component to the database. About 2 years ago or so, we started implementing this and coming up with schema for it. And that the reason for doing this, right, is to include more laboratory results that can help constrain poorly constrained case histories and support field data and fill in gaps in like those K sigma or K alpha studies that are a little limited at the moment. And so we set up the schema that has describe tables, fields, and relationships among those tables, and it's all organized in such a way that it can all be queried very efficiently and stored easily. And so what types of data we have in the database for lab tests are triaxial tests, both monotonic and cyclic, direct simple shear, either 1D or 2D, again, cyclic or monotonic, relative density, Atterberg limits, grain size, index tests, such as specific gravity or water content, and consolidation. And just to give an idea of how this workflow might be, imagine you have a blend that you're making in a lab, a blend of soil. And so what you would do is you'd create an entry in your lab table to describe what lab this was done in and a lab program, so your testing program that you're doing, and those two are linked together. And then you fill in information for each sample that you're preparing, and then each specimen from within each sample that you're doing tests on, and then you fill in your simple shear tests, general information with metadata, information about each stage, and then the actual data, the time series data. And so you can also then, if you're doing this on soil that was sampled in the field, in like a boring, you can link these sample tables with your test tables that describe your boring logs. And so that's how it's all interconnected within the database. And the benefits of all that, right, are that you can have the database access easily. If I can get this video to play. Not sure why. Okay. Well, we just won't show that, but what it was going to show is that you can easily query the database, and we've written tools that allow users to just access and view simple shear data or triaxial data, and with drop-down menus to be able to select which sample you want to look at, which lab program you want to be looking in, that kind of thing. And so it makes it really nice and convenient for users. And the last thing I'm going to mention about the lab component is as you saw before, Scott talked about, we have over 1,300 tests now on plasticity. And so what we can do is, it's really important for things like when we're looking at previous papers like Boulanger and Idris 2006, where they established their relationship, where they found where soils were susceptible or non-susceptible to liquefaction based on their plasticity index. We can do that, but now on a much larger scale, and that's why the database is so important. And so given that, and what we see on the right here is all those data points from the database. Obviously now we still would have to go in and for each data point determine if that's a critical layer that's liquefying or not, if it's near any observations of manifestation and that kind of thing. But this is all important for us to be able to figure out these problems. So we want to invite anyone who has more data sets or any kind of case history to please go ahead and try and add that to our database, or contact any of us for help adding that to the database. So to move on quickly here, we'll go to the Mihama Award case history that we will be talking about. And so this is a site in Japan that had liquefaction occur during the 2011 Tohoku earthquake. And so here's a zoom in of it. It's this, this port here, and all this land here was, this whole stretch was created using hydraulic fill. It was just underwater. And they did that out of these large soil discharge pipes, where they just pumped it out and they filled it in with all the soil that exists there now. No, they didn't do any densification of the soil or anything, just deposited like as is shown in the photo there. And so there were observations of liquefaction manifestation in this particular area. And so several different borings and CPTs and SASW tests were performed in this area. And so this is directly taken from a notebook that I queried the database with, and I am just plotting cone penetration tests, borings, shear wave velocity measurements of different symbols, and then also any notes that are entered in the database on liquefaction manifestation. And so
2 minutes left. 2 minutes left.
Okay. Here's a map showing where the manifestations occurred. And so you can see the discharge pipe here, this black line. And so all around where the discharge pipe was, there was manifestations observed. But as you get farther away from the discharge pipe, there was no manifestation observed. And so there's this transect of tests done here, from starting from boring 1 and CPT 1 all the way over to CPT 6 and boring 6, with the expectation that as you move away from the discharge types, the fines content of the soil increases because there's lower energy in the flow from the water. And so that is true. And so this transect, the idea was to look for that gradient in fines content and find in here the breaking point where we lose susceptibility based on the plasticity index or the fines content, or combination of those things in the soil profile. So we're going to zoom in here on the transect, and you can see that transect plotted here and all the CPTs and borings. And right, so these 4 CPTs were in a zone where there was no liquefaction observed, and these 2 CPTs 1 and 2 were in the zone where there's manifestation observed, directly next to manifestation evidence. And we can look at those data and the database, and we can plot up both boring 1 and CPT 1 all next to each other in the stratigraphy plotted there. We can also look at CPT 3 and boring 3. And by looking at that data, we can then compute factor of safety against liquefaction, LPI, LSN, all these different indices for determining liquefaction potential or severity. And what we see for CPT1 and boring 1 is, as we expect, very high and high severity indices. But what's weird is that CPT3 and boring 3, which are not next to manifestations, also predicted high and moderate manifestation. And so we looked at another newer method that was introduced by Daniel Hudebrod and John Bray recently. And this involves calculating the excess head in your soil profile that occurred from the shaking and gives you a liquefaction demand parameter and a crust resistance parameter. And from those, you can determine the severity of liquefaction manifestations. So here's plots of those two again. And this does a better job of capturing that CPT1 has a much higher L sub D with depth at the very top of the profile than the L sub D that we get from CPT3. And you can see on this plot here that we have CPT1 and 2 plotting in severe, and then most of the other non-liquefaction CPTs plotting in the none category for manifestation. And so to complement this work, we plan to do more nonlinear effective stress analyses to help refine the procedure and figure out some of the profiles that aren't matching what we would expect from some of the indices. And I think I'm out of time, so I'll wrap it up there.